Hi guys, it's Debbie, and it's finally time for our yearly recap in which we get to chat about the best and the worst in the world of films and series. Today we'll be speaking about what I personally consider some of the best series of the year, hopefully giving you some interesting tips on what to watch. And as always, I would love to hear your opinion on the topic, so what you've been watching, what you think about the titles I picked, let me know everything with a comment right below. Here on my channel, you will find my other videos about the best and the worst films of the year. If you don't see them in this precise moment, well, first of all, thank you, because that means you're watching this video as soon as it came out, but don't worry, you will see them here posted in just a couple of days. Now, getting right to the point, as you will see with many end of the year recaps, because 2020 was such an odd year in general, and such a weird year film production wise, what actually eventually made it to our screens was quite an eclectic selection. This is because many big productions have been postponed. So while usually smaller productions with more uncommon topics would have been shadowed by huge advertisement giants, this year they actually made it to a wide audience. So you will see this reflected across many end of year lists, even on my personal one for today. Now, the first series I loved watching this year and which I would like to speak about today is Unorthodox. I yet have to hear one person say something particularly bad about this series. Everybody felt touched by it, regardless of their usual personal taste in visual media. Unorthodox is based on a true story which originates in a very conservative, ultra-orthodox neighborhood of New York City. So although the people from that community live in 21st century America, they don't use the internet, they don't read anything not connected to their religious views, they follow a very strict dress code, but they also prohibit women from accessing even a basic education or working. Images of women are blacked out in kids' books, they aren't even in advertisements, and they eventually led into forced marriages where they are asked to have as many children as possible. This very conservative way of life obviously leads to many unhappy existences for many individuals in that community, and this is particularly reflected very harshly on women who have no independence. For example, the protagonist of the series Unorthodox is based on a real young woman who loved her community and her origins and her culture, but at the same time couldn't accept many aspects of it. The forced love, the forced sex, the lack of individuality, having to always depend on others, everything being decided for you, and of course the repercussions if you try to stand up for yourself. All thoughts which the protagonist sums up in the sentence, "God expected too much of me." Her only ray of hope is when a friend offers to help her get out of that environment and experience a completely different lifestyle. The series has a few flaws, such as the outside world being depicted in an exaggeratedly varied manner, probably to show the complete opposite to the society our protagonist is familiar with. But as a whole, I would absolutely recommend this series. As an atheist and a person who has been struggling for many years to find a definitive identity, seeing these people whose life is so integrated in their religion, so integrated in the community, while at the same time questioning the righteousness of it all, makes a really good story, a really interesting point for discussion. And the protagonist was beautifully portrayed by Shira Haas, a name which I'm sure we will be hearing more of in the future. If you like Unorthodox, there actually is a similar A24 film called Menage, which features the same love for that community, but while also feeling helpless and lost in all the strict rules imposed by Hasidic Judaism. In this case, the protagonist is a single father struggling to balance work and private life while also questioning part of the traditional ways of being required by those close to him. Anyway, time to move on to the next series. Now, remember how earlier I was mentioning that this series could feature some different titles? Well, the next series is The Midnight Gospel, which is basically a psychedelic trip down the deepest tunnels of your mind. The series is created based on parts of a previous podcast hosted by one of the creators, in which many philosophical, ethic, spiritual topics were covered. So there is a lot of death and love, but also nihilism, acceptance of reality, dealing with grief, being normal or unique, use of drugs, enlightenment and spirituality, the value of things, God, history, embarrassment, all which culminate in one beautiful final episode which either has you crying your eyes out or staring at the ceiling all night long. The concept is brought on screen through the idea of a spacecaster. It's basically the space version of a podcast host who travels to various planets where he meets their inhabitants and has them give interesting insights on different topics. And most of the objects, characters, situations surrounding them represent those thoughts recreated through art. So of course the imagery is breathtakingly bizarre. I think some people were put off by the idea of the Midnight Gospel because they thought it was simply just a stoner story. Let's smoke some weed and let's have some deep discussions about what happens after death and about God. But I think that was more of a bait because that depiction of drugs in that classic sense is only presented in the first series, and then it goes way beyond that. It's more of a fully intellectual trip. I think I never gave this series the recognition it deserved when it was first released, so hopefully this will make up for that because it really is a gem in the darkness of 2020. Next up is a series featuring a bunch of cool people, including, but not limited to, Al Pacino and Logan Lerman, and that series is Hunters, which is a fictionalized adaptation of very messed up events which actually happened after the end of World War II. Now, a little background to the series. Basically, after the end of the war, thousands of Nazis made their way over to the United States, where they lived under completely new existences, completely new identities. They were teachers, they were your neighbor, they were parents, they were grandparents, they were your doctor. Now, some of them did this on their own. They just escaped and hid there under a new identity, while others were actually brought to the United States by the United States government. This was because at the end of the war, the world was split in half. Some countries were under the influence of the Soviet Union, while others were under the sphere of the Western world, represented by the United States. And Germany was exactly halfway there, and it was split in half, hence the Berlin Wall, etc. Now, because many high-ranking Nazis were actually pretty educated people, especially in scientific fields. After all, they were carrying out twisted experiments on people and developing the most lethal weapons. The United States government preferred to have them be brought over to America rather than leave them in the hands of the Soviet Union, making it an even harder enemy to defeat. But when the American people started realizing that the friendly lady next door used to run gas chambers on the other side of the pond, people started to get together to hunt down these criminals. So here comes in our series, Hunters, which follows exactly this. People in the 70s who ganged up to hunt down Nazis. Of course, it's fictionalized and enhanced with cool action sequences to make everything more engaging, but it's a very well put together series because it also covers the analysis of whether revenge is the correct solution. When is it acceptable? Is it even acceptable? And is death the only punishment, or would that also make you a monster? You're probably going to enjoy this series if you're a big fan of Tarantino's works, especially films like Inglourious Basterds or Django, Kill Bill, because of how violence is depicted and because of the analysis of violence and of the ethics of revenge. The next series on the list is one probably many of you were expecting, and that is The Queen's Gambit, which is basically Netflix's pride and joy of the moment. It's currently the big series. Now, The Queen's Gambit is the story of chess matches, but made in a cool and engaging manner. Because if you think of 7 hours of watching chess matches and analysing old techniques and previous games and knight to d7 and pawn to b6, it all sounds kind of boring, doesn't it? But the creators of the series managed to show how it isn't boring, and they transformed the topic into a really interesting and engaging storyline. I literally clicked on the first episode and I only took a break 4 hours later. In The Queen's Gambit, Anya Taylor-Joy portrays a child chess prodigy who ends up winning tournament after tournament. She's beaten the best players out there, she's ploughing her way through a very stressful environment, but in addition to that, a staple since her childhood is struggling with mental health, the absence of her parents, substance addiction, being alone in the world, struggling to trust people, and being a top-notch international chess player doesn't exactly ease the stress. All of this is depicted in a very captivating manner, which makes you really interested in the matches, even if you have no clue what's going on. And if you do know what's going on, the cool thing is that the actors were actually playing the games. You can freeze any match from any episode and you will see a legitimate game. And this includes the fast matches, the speed matches, also where the protagonist has to play against like 3 other people at the same time. Then before we move on to the last title on the list, I would quickly like to acknowledge some honourable mentions which didn't make it into the final panel. First up, I would like to mention I May Destroy You, a British series starring Michaela Cohen as a millennial icon and popular writer in London who is trying to piece her life back together after a night in which she completely blacked out and her only memory is of being sexually assaulted. And then another honourable mention is Never Have I Ever, for basically being one of the few teen high school series which are actually funny and deep for somebody over the age of 15. And last but not least, I actually pretty much enjoyed Space Force, which is basically The Office meets science fiction. But now, for the last choice on my list, we have the absolute mess that was Tiger King. Now, hear me out. Tiger King is something you could only describe as a disastrous situation which has an entertaining side to it, and you can't stop watching it while the whole situation is just collapsing in front of your eyes. It was released when most of the world was entering lockdown. The TV was screaming at us that the end was here. People were dying alone without even a goodbye. Nobody had a clue what was going on. Here in Italy, we had army trucks fully loaded of coffins, and the only thing the whole world could do was lock up in their houses and hope for the best. So regardless of Tiger King not being a superb achievement in technical filmmaking, for a few hours it managed to drag us away from the craziness of the real world because we couldn't believe just how insane it all was. It was so unexpected, so crazy, so irrational that it took us away from the sadness of the world, even just for a few hours. Tiger King is the story of Joe Exotic, a big cat owner and a very eccentric individual. Now, most of us expected this series to focus on animal abuse and the cruelty of zoos, but that's just a fraction of the whole story. As the full title better explains, it's Tiger King, Murder, Mayhem and Madness, and all the characters are tied together in a twisted net of greediness and hitmen and unsolved disappearances and odd weddings followed by odd funerals and money and explosions and presidential campaigns, Las Vegas strippers. It had it all. I think everybody I've spoken to found Tiger King way more engaging than they expected, in all different senses, because most of it makes you laugh at the absurdity of the situation shown, but at the same time it makes you kind of feel sad and think, do people actually go to that extent? Do people actually do this? Anyway, if you haven't seen Tiger King yet, I'll leave it there for your curiosity. So with that, we have reached the end of what I personally consider some of the most interesting 2020 series you should watch. Please let me know what you think about them, what you personally have been watching, what you would recommend. Let me know everything with a comment below the video. Remember, on the channel, you will be able to find the other videos about the best and worst films. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye.